And it's good to see all of you here tonight. For the time that I have with you, I'd like to just cover one short story in Judges 1. Hopefully you already can be turning there. In Judges 1, just a short story, and all I want to do is cover that little short story, pick it apart just a bit, and then number 2, we're going to walk that story to the New Testament. And then number 3, we're going to show the symptoms of the problem we saw in this chapter. And number 4, at the end, we're just going to show some solutions. And then the lesson will be yours. So we only have 4 things that we need to talk about. But what I want to do before we get into number 1 is get us in the mindset of the Judges. And we've been studying Judges on Friday night. And I've got some Galatians in this sermon too, which we have been studying Tuesday night, but now that's concluded. And it's a moment where Judges and Galatians start bleeding together, and there's a central theme that's being brought out. And hopefully for the time that I have with you, I'll be able to bring that message to light. In the period of the Judges, as Ross read, Joshua is coming to an end of his reign, for lack of a better word. He's conquered the land of Canaan, and now he puts it on the responsibility of the tribes to finish the work, where Joshua is going to go basically into some type of period of retirement. And there's an expectation that the tribes are going to continue to drive out the Canaanite people and possess the land. And the problem is, even back in Joshua, is that they don't do it. You know, he begs them and pleads them, you need to drive out the land. There's warnings, there's consequences. But frankly, when the rubber hits the road, you have several tribes that just refuse to do it. And so then we turn out of Joshua and we get to Judges chapter 1, and we see the same thing is going on. Before we read, we're going to specifically, this story, focus on the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. He's referred to just as Joseph in this chapter. And we understand going into the story that Joshua has broken the Canaanites. Maybe you've heard the phrase, Joshua broke the Canaanites back. And the thought is with that is that Joshua in his conquest, the first conquest, did the majority of the damage to the Canaanite nation. As in, he tore up their infrastructure. He tore down their major cities, their fortress cities. And after Joshua was done with his work, it was supposed to be easy for the Israelite people to take over. For one, Joshua did and conquered the land through many signs and wonders in that book. And that generation should have seen God's power firsthand. So when Joshua comes into the promised land, the Jordan stops and they cross over through dry land over the Jordan. That's one of the first miracles. We go to Jericho. And do we take Jericho in some normal way? No, God commands the people just to march around so many times for so many days and the walls just come tumbling down, right? Joshua asked God to stop the sun and the moon during a battle. And it happens. The moon and the sun stop from our perspective in the sky, and Joshua's given more daylight to beat the Amalekites. So there's all these signs and wonders and miracles Joshua performs before the people. And now that Joshua's time is over, it was the responsibility of the tribes to go out and remove the villages and the people that are still living in the land. And so as we get to Judges chapter 1, the people are doing that. We first look at a story about the people of Judah, the southern tribe of Israel, and they do what they're supposed to do. We meet Caleb, we meet Othniel, and they drive out the people in Judah. But then we go and we look up north to Joseph in verse 22. And look what's happening with the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's tribe. Verse 22 says, and the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. So the house of Joseph sent men to spy out Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will show you mercy. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz, which is the name to this day. However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean or its villages, or Tatnach and its villages, the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam, or the villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. For the Canaanites were determined to dwell in the land. And so it came to pass, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. We continue reading, and it gives the same thought for the other tribes. But what I want us to notice here is this story starts out really positive. We have that line in verse 22, the house of Joseph went against Bethel, and the Lord was with them, right? And we think the tribe of Joshua, the one that Joshua belongs to, this tribe's going to do the right thing. The Lord is with them. They begin to drive out the people like they were commanded to do. But what happens? Well, they meet a man, and they tell the man, hey, we'll spare you and your family if you show us the entrance to the city. And he shows them the entrance to the city, and they wipe out the city, but they let the man and his family go. Was there allowed that to happen under God's commandment here? No. The plan from God was drive the people completely out, wipe them out, right? But what they do is they say, okay, well, we're going to let this family go because they helped us. They decided to make a decision with their own personal reasoning there. And as we digress through the story, we're not just sparing families, now we're sparing cities. And then we're sparing whole giant cities and areas of land. And the next thing we know, Joseph isn't driving out any Canaanites anymore. What are they doing instead? Well, they're putting them under tribute, right? Which is saying, okay, you live here, and we're going to collect taxes from you. So we're going to become wealthy on the work that you do, but you don't have to leave. Did God allow them to do this? They took matters into their own hands, didn't they? And you see them digress into doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing. So we start out with, the Lord was with the house of Joseph. And then we get to verse 35 when Israel or Joseph, yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they started putting these Canaanites under tribute. Well, what happened? Why did they do that? Judges 2, if we kept on reading, this spirals or snowballs into the point that the people just do evil and they're disobedient. And if you look in Judges chapter 2, verse 2, the angel of the Lord comes down to address the people, and this is what he says. He reminds them of Egypt, and then in verse 2 he says, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? So the angel of the Lord personally calls them out on the tribute thing. Like, I didn't tell you to do this. I told you to wipe them out. I told you to drive them out. By the time we get to verse 10, look at this. Chapter 2:10 says, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work that he had done for Israel. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Where did the Baals come from? Because up until this point in the Bible, we don't know who the Baals are. And all of a sudden, the Baals are on the scene. The reason why they're worshiping the Baals in chapter 2 goes back to when they didn't drive out the people and instead they taxed them. And as they were taxing the people, what did the people teach the Israelites? They taught them how to worship the Baals. Why did God tell them to drive them out completely? So they wouldn't teach them how to worship the Baals and to do the wicked things that they do. So because of their disobedience, now something even more wicked has come in. And we see Joseph disobey and digress in this way, even though they were supposed to be strong. Well, why does this happen? And I'm looking for more. What is the motivation behind this? How does Joseph go from this to this in verse 35? Well, let's walk through it again. And this time we'll talk more about motivations. Do you see in this story that perhaps Joseph began to trust in its own strength instead of the strength of God? Where technically it was God who tore down the walls of Jericho. It was God who was with them and why they were victorious. But eventually it comes to the point that Joseph grows mighty, and perhaps they start thinking, well, actually it's our strength of why we were able to conquest this land. Joseph perhaps began to think that they were alone and they were solely responsible for taking the land. God becomes further and further away from that equation. They give credit to themselves. What about this? And I think this one's very true in the text. Joseph thinks at some point that they have the right to choose what to do with these Canaanites. After all, they're the ones who conquered them, right? Why does God get to tell us about what we do with the Canaanites? Well, the answer should be it's because God's the one who drove them out. But they don't think God has anything to do with it anymore. They're saying, no, we drove them out. We get to tax them. We get to choose who lives and who dies. They feel like they get to make that decision. Perhaps here Joseph believes that they choose what is right and wrong. After all, it's their land. It belongs to them. We choose who lives here. And they start making these foolish decisions and disobeying God. You know, they earned it. They deserved it. And that's a progression of thought through Judges. It's not that God did this for us. It's not that God gave us grace. No, it's we worked for it. We did it. We earned it. We get to decide what happens. And that attitude is being conceited. That's what that word means. Joseph became strong. Israel became strong. And what did that do to their faith? Well, it made them conceited, didn't it? A good definition of conceited is just glorying without reason, where you begin to start trusting in your own power instead of the power of God. It happens when you give yourself credit for things that God did. And when we begin to do that is when disobedience creeps in. Because it's not about God anymore. We don't owe God anything. No, we just get to repay ourselves and reward ourselves for what we have done. Well, seeing this here and as a pattern through this early chapter in the Judges, let's now walk that to the New Testament. That theme of being conceited, giving ourselves credit for things that we think we have done. We saw it here in Joseph, but can you think of other people in the Old Testament that God made them strong? God gave them earthly gifts, but they became conceited about those earthly gifts and they use it for their own desires. We don't have to go far in Judges to meet this character. Did God make Samson strong? And you know, this is like literally strong, right? Not just a metaphor. God literally made Samson strong. Was it because Samson worked out a lot and ate right and that's the right reason why he was strong? No, it was because God made him strong. And frankly, when we read that story, was it his long hair technically that made him strong? No, it didn't have anything to do with the hair. That's just what was demanded by God to fulfill that blessing. It was God who made Samson strong. But what was the life that Samson led mostly? Well, Samson forgot who God was a lot, and sometimes he used his strength for his own desires. When we read that story, he keeps on revisiting Delilah. Why is he revisiting Delilah even though he's in mortal danger? Because he thinks his strength will just get him out of the problem. And his strength does get him out of the problem sometimes, but eventually it's the reason why he falls. God gave him an earthly blessing, and he used that blessing to his advantage, and he became conceited, and he forgot about God. What about this person? What about David? God made David king. I mean, you can picture God found David as this shepherd kid running around in the field. And what did God do with that kid? He taught him how to kill a bear. He helped him kill a lion. He helped him kill a giant, and then he made him king. And he bestows all these earthly blessings on David. And what does David do with that? Well, at one point, he forgot about God, and he used the position that God gave him for his own desires. And he took Bathsheba, and then he used his authority as king to kill her husband, to cover up his sin. What happened here? David became conceited with his own power that God had given him. He had forgotten God, hadn't he? What's another person that you can think that's like this? Well, not far from David, what about Solomon? God made Solomon wise and wealthy, didn't he? Did Solomon just turn around and use all those gifts from God for God? No, eventually Solomon forgot God, and he became conceited, and he used his abilities to serve other gods, right? And again, it's this pattern of the Old Testament, where the more and more God gives you earthly blessings, the more and more he risks you leaving him. You forget to be dependent on God. You forget where these gifts come from, and instead you use them for your own pleasures and your own desires. You become conceited. Frankly, it would be easier for us to get up here and list the men and women who were blessed by God and did not become conceited than it would to be to list all the people who became conceited. Frankly, the only people I can think of that God gave incredible gifts to in the Old Testament and did not become conceited were Abraham, Joseph, Daniel, Esther, and that's about it. That's it. So thinking on these lines, sometimes Christians struggle with the thought of why God doesn't materially take care of us the way that he did with people in the Old Testament. And some Christians struggle with that, and I understand where that's coming from. If you're having financial stress, you would wonder, well, why doesn't God just remove this financial stress by snapping his fingers? If you have health issues, it is very understandable for a Christian to think, why won't God just snap his fingers and remove all my health issues? Sometimes we think about those things. Why doesn't God just give all of his Christians a lot of money and make them all very healthy and they'll be able to do more good than they're already doing? Why doesn't God just bestow all those blessings on us? And you have people that take it as far as they begin to be part of this social gospel, wealth and health gospel, and they get caught up in all these things. But looking at these people, could you see how God would be worried or very careful about the earthly blessings he bestows on his people? Because frankly, when God outpours wealth and health and power to his people, what happens to them often? Well, they become conceited. They forget to be dependent on God, and they end up becoming very independent on themselves. I think probably Paul puts it very well when he explains in 2 Corinthians 12 that when we're weak, what is God? God's strong. But when we're strong, or when we think we're strong, what is God in our mind? Well, God's weak because we don't need him. And that's something to consider when we have those conversations. God is very much worried about the detriment of our souls by giving us too much on this earth and making us conceited people. Now, here's this thread. Let's walk to the New Testament. God has not made me wise and wealthy or a king or super strong, but God has made me holy. That's a spiritual blessing that he's bestowed on us abundantly. Forgiveness of sins, something that Hebrews 2 says he didn't even offer the angels, but he did offer his people. Have us as Christians, do we sometimes become conceited because of this blessing we've been given? I think the apostles would tell us yes. That this is a gift from God that unless we handle correctly, we too become conceited with this great blessing from God. That we've become holy. We've been made this holy, special people to God. And then what happens is sometimes we forget God and we start telling ourselves, well, I earned this holiness. Well, I deserve this holiness. Well, these people over here, they don't deserve to be here, but I deserve to be here. I put the work into this. I deserve to be holy. I deserve to be a Christian. And that mindset is extremely dangerous when it's almost as if we become spiritually strong, and that leads us to becoming conceited. Look at Titus 3 with me. We could look at Ephesians 2. That would be another good place to make this point. But Paul here tries to snap us back to reality instead of becoming conceited. In verse 1, he says, remember to be subject to rulers and authorities. And then he says in verse 2, chapter 3, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. Well, why would we show all humility to all men? Verse 3 answers that. For we ourselves were all once foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. But when the kindness and the love of our God, our Savior, toward man appeared, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us, through the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Spirit, whom he poured out on us abundantly through Jesus Christ our Savior, that having been justified by his grace, we should become heirs according to the hope of eternal life. That is a long explanation for why we should be humble to all men. Why should we treat our fellow man, no matter who they are, with humility? Because every single one of us in this room have been, in the past, foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy and hating one another. We've all lived that life. And the only reason we got out of it is because God is kind. That is the only reason we got out of that. And because he was kind, it wasn't by our own works of righteousness. It was just because it was God's good pleasure to save us. Looking at and paralleling that to the promised land, would the Israelite people have been able to conquer the promised land without God? Just think about the logistics of moving 1 million people through the woods and through the desert out of Egypt, the most powerful nation at the time. Get them on the other side of the river, get them to cross the river, and for them to come and attack all these fortified cities that have been there for hundreds of years. The logistics of that is crazy. How do you even feed the people as you travel? God had a solution for that, but if God wasn't part of the picture, how would they feed the people? If God had not been part of the Exodus story or the Joshua story, they would have died of starvation a month into it. That's what would have happened. They would have not been able to conquer the land unless God is kind. Now, we can say the same thing for us spiritually. Would any of us be in this room right now tonight unless God is kind? Not a single one of us would be here. Would any of us know the goodness of God? No. The only reason why we even know who God is because God is kind, right? The friendships that we enjoy with one another, would any of us have these friendships unless God was kind? For another level, for us that are married, many of you, the only reason why you met your spouse is because God is kind and you were introduced to him through his family. The more and more I start counting up things in my life, I wouldn't have had any of them unless God had helped, unless God had intervened and he was kind. I am nothing without God. And if I understand that I'm nothing without God, of course I would treat all men with humility. Well, let's make this third point. Am I conceited? And that's a question I think we need to ask ourselves. Am I somebody that forgets God and forgets where I came from and forgets what God did for me? And I go on and I'm trying to think that I'm independent and I don't need his help. Well, thankfully, the apostles give us conceited symptoms. And they bring this up in several different places. Turn to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5. Paul gives us an example and uses the word conceited. Right here, after explaining the works of the flesh and then gives us the fruit of the Spirit to combat that, he ends that thought with verse 26 of chapter 5. He says, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. I want to save verse 1 for a little bit later, but look at verse 3. Here's a good definition of what he just described. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. What is a conceited person? A conceited person is someone who thinks they're something, but they are nothing. And he says, what do? You played yourself. You're a fool, right? What does a conceited person do? Back in verse 26. They provoke one another. They envy one another. You can get some of the humblest people in the world. You can get the humblest people in the world. You can put them all in a room. And you just get one conceited person and you throw them in there. What does that one conceited person do? He starts stirring up everything, doesn't he? He's the one that starts the fights. He's the one that starts all the problems. And it's because when you get a whole bunch of humble people and you put one prideful person in the pot, they ruin the pot. What we see here is this is the person that is conceited. They're constantly battling with brethren. Paul speaks again to this in 2 Corinthians 12:20. Look at the things that go along with that word there. Lest there be contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, backbitings, whispering, conceits, tumults. And that word right there just means uproars, causing an uproar, causing a strife. Look at the things this is combined with. It's really all how we interact with each other. And when you have a jealous person, when you have a person that's envious, when you have a person that likes to gossip, when you have a person that likes to cause uproars, what's one of the heart problems that's causing all those things? It's that they're conceited. They've forgotten what God has done for them, and they really start to believe that they deserve to be there. And they deserve things. When in reality, all the good things that we have come from God. We're not deserving of any of God's blessings. It's just his good pleasure to do so. What about this one? Back in Galatians 6, verse 1, Paul addressing the conceited brethren, he says this, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted." You know, a conceited person is someone who feels like that other brethren don't even deserve to be in the same room with them. That they just look down on others. And they don't feel like this person's deserving of their attention. They don't think this person is worth speaking to them and looking in them in the eye when they talk to them. You know? When so that person tries to come and talk to them about some kind of biblical thought, they just shun it away and go, you don't know what you're talking about. And they don't invite them or intrigue them in anything. Well, why in the world would a spiritual person or someone who believes they're mighty in the faith, they're strong, why in the world would the strong spiritual person not be the first person to help the weak brother or the weak sister? Isn't that what this says? You who are spiritual, it's your job to restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. The strongest person in the room, if they really are the strongest person in the room, would be the person that doesn't look down on anybody, but actively looks for ways to help others. That person's not conceited. That person's actually strong in the faith, like described here. And one more, another symptom. You know, what about this one? And this goes back to the Joshua tribe in Judges 1. I think a conceited symptom is when we care more about what we think is right rather than what God said was right. And that's what happened to the people there in Judges. It wasn't no longer about what God said was right. It was about what they thought was right at that moment. And that what they thought was to tax the people with tribute instead of wiping them out like God said. I've been playing a game recently trying to find things that I think is in the Bible, but is not actually in the Bible. If you've been coming to our Judges class, one of those things was Ehud's story. I was convinced that there was a verse in the Ehud story that when Ehud showed them his sword on the wrong side, because he was left-handed, to the guards, and that's why they let him into the king. I was convinced in my mind that was part of the story. And when I taught Ehud, I realized that isn't in there. That's not in there at all. And we sometimes innocently make a habit of doing that, where we have ideas about what happened in here, but it actually didn't happen. For some reason, we got it, or we got it from somewhere else, and somehow in our brains, we thought it was part of the story. Now, that's very innocent, and there's not a lot of consequences for me getting that one part of the Ehud story wrong, but I needed to get it right. Can you see how, though, that mentality works into more important things? Where you'll meet good Christian brethren that truly believe that there's things that we need to be doing or not doing, and it's not in here at all. And they care much more and very passionate about what they think is right than actually what God said was right. I think where this comes up a lot is in the elder qualifications. And Lord willing, I'm going to get to preach about that Sunday morning. But it's just been interesting, just in the few years that I've gotten to be a part of that, is how many brethren, good brethren, will come up to you and they will give you a qualification for an elder that does not exist. And they'll talk to you for hours and very passionately about how an elder is supposed to be qualified in this way, and they never show you a passage that says that. What's the problem? The problem is that they become to care more about what they think is right than actually what God said was right. Now, I'm not going to give you a specific example because I don't want someone to be like, well, no, that is right. And I don't want you to miss the point of this, which is we have to be the type of people, not like that Joshua tribe, that cares deeply about what God said and really doesn't care all that much about what I think. And that's the heart of a true disciple. And that takes time and effort and study, but it's very possible with the clear words that God has given us. As we wrap this thought up, how does Satan tempt the strong to fall? Joseph was strong, the Lord was with him. How does Satan tempt strong people to fall? Would you say that he just tries to make them conceited? That's all he has to do. He has to make them think that they're standing on their own feet and not on God's good pleasure and grace. And that would be the first step to make him fall. And I think Paul makes that clear in 10:12 of 1 Corinthians. Take heed lest you fall. That you don't stand on your own feet. You have to stand on God's feet to stand strong. These are the symptoms, and we've talked about the problem, but let's just wrap this up nicely with the solution. The solution is simply just an attitude. You know, a lot of the things that we do, the solution is just simply an attitude adjustment that fits better with being a disciple of God. These are things that I've thought about that I think help us with that attitude. Number one is that we have to remember God. And I say that because of Judges chapter 2, when the angel of the Lord comes down to talk to Israel after putting all these tribes into tributes and disobeying him, all he needs to say is, look, remember what I did for you in Egypt. I saved you out of Egypt. Now, why are you disobeying me? And I think the solution is simply to remember who God is. And a Christian that remembers who God is can't be conceited. I have to remember that I'm just a branch on a much bigger tree. Paul uses this example in Romans 11, talking to the Gentile Christians. You know, he says, but if you do boast that you're part of this tree, you're part of Jesus, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Can you imagine a little twig on a big old tree and that twig boasting and talking about how strong and mighty he is? That's the very thing Jesus sees when he sees his people boast about how mighty they are. Because what could you do to that tree? You could just snap it off, right? Or if the tree fell, the twig would be gone. And that's very much our relationship with Jesus. We do not support the root supports us. We do not support Jesus up. No, Jesus supports us up. And we would all be on the ground without him. I've got to remember that I did not stop the Jordan River. And that would be very true for those people, right? Did they not remember that they didn't stop the Jordan River? They watched God stop it, and then they got to enjoy the blessing of it. They didn't stop the Jordan River. I've got to remember that I did not destroy Jericho. Those people didn't lift a finger to knock down those walls. I mean, they got up that morning and they walked around the city. I'm not trying to take that away from them. They were obedient, but they didn't do anything to knock the walls over. They were only obedient to God, and God knocked the walls over. They needed to remember that. They didn't destroy Jericho, God did. Now, something more reflective of us, I've got to remember that I didn't die on the cross. I didn't do it. And Lord willing, probably, I'm not going to have to do it. Frankly, if I died on the cross, I would still be dead in my sins. My death wouldn't be good enough to forgive just my sins. I didn't do that. Going along with that, I've got to remember that I did not make myself holy. It was not of my works of righteousness. It was me just receiving the free gift from God. I did not make myself holy. What's interesting is when you have people that try to attribute baptism into some kind of work. If I look at all the work God did to make his people holy, creating the earth, sending the prophets, writing the gospel, sending Jesus, putting his son through what he put his son through, sending out the apostles and watching them bleed and die for the cause too. And he puts all this work into making his people holy. What do I have to do to receive that gift? Splash. Is that even anything comparison, right? That's in no comparison to the work that God did. That's just simply being obedient to what he asked you to do. That would be like those people celebrating as if they're the ones that pushed down the Jericho walls. I did not make myself holy. I've become holy by the free gift of God, just like you became holy. And lastly here, I got to remember that I'm nothing without God. And the disciple that has that attitude, do they become conceited? They can never become conceited if they keep that attitude. Thank you for your attention. You can put away your Bibles or get ready to sing in just a second. In my young life, maybe in the early 2000s, there was this thought in the religious world that your stories or your testimonies were important somehow. And you would have people would meet you at school and they would say like, can I tell you about my story, my testimony? And I would, be like, okay, I'm trying to eat lunch. And they would tell me about, their coming to Jesus story, and they were very happy to share that story. And honestly, I would treat it differently now, but in high school, I was like, this is the most boring story I've ever heard. Let me tell you something funnier that happened the other day. I didn't want to hear that. And even today, every once in a while, you'll meet people that want to tell you their story. And sometimes those stories are boring. Sometimes they're funny. Sometimes people's stories about coming to God, even our stories, they'll bring tears to your eyes. There's some stories I enjoy hearing. I like that person's story about how they found Jesus. That's great, and we can share those things to each other if we want to. That's fine. I don't care. But is this my story? And I'm not just talking about this, but I can say this. Is this my story right here? Or we could just point to the universe. Is this my story? This is what I think now. This isn't my story. This is Jesus' story. And I just get to be a little part of it. And I know that we love our stories. Our identity comes from our stories. We enjoy those things. And I think there's a reason and there's a time and place for that. But I think it's important to remember overall, this universe, this gospel, anything that's of any value and importance on this planet, this is all Jesus' story. This is a story about him saving the day. And you and me, we get to be, and it's a blessing to be, but we just get to be a little part of his story. If there's anyone here tonight that wants to be a part of his story, why don't you let us assist you if you will come forward as we stand and sing.